Sometimes the most dangerous weapon a man carries isn't a gun or a knife, but his prejudice. It hides behind his smile. It sits in the way he shakes your hand. It whispers in the words he chooses and shouts in the ones he refuses to say. And in this story, one man's prejudice cost him everything. A corporate office tower filled with power, ambition, and greed. On the surface, it is a place where dreams are made. But behind closed doors, not every dream is welcome. This is the story of a man who thought his position gave him power over others. A hiring manager who believed he could decide who was worthy and who wasn't. But what he didn't know was that the man he tried to humiliate would be the one person who could decide his fate. Cut to a young black man walking toward the building. His suit is sharp, his posture confident, his resume in hand. His name is Marcus Johnson. To anyone watching, he looks prepared, professional, and ready. But to the wrong kind of man, his skin color is the only thing they'll see. Marcus wasn't just another applicant. He wasn't just another resume. He carried with him something much deeper, something that would soon shake this company to its very core. Marcus Johnson walked into that building with hope. His resume was polished, his experience undeniable. He had graduated top of his class in business administration, worked years in management, and carried recommendations that could open doors anywhere. But still, in a world like this, doors didn't always open the same way for everyone. The camera follows Marcus as he enters the gleaming lobby. The receptionist greets him politely, but with that hint of forced politeness, the kind that masks a silent judgment. He takes a seat, waiting, adjusting his tie, rehearsing his words. On the other side of those walls sat a man named Richard Harlow, the hiring manager. To his colleagues, Richard was respectable, professional, a man who knew talent when he saw it. But beneath that mask of professionalism hid a bitter arrogance, the kind that believed some people were simply less deserving. The music drops to a low, tense hum as Richard steps into the lobby. He glances at Marcus, his eyes narrow. His smirk barely hides his disdain. In that instant, Richard made a decision. He didn't see Marcus's qualifications. He didn't see his accomplishments. He saw only his skin. And from that moment, the interview was already over. Marcus follows Richard into the office. The walls are lined with framed achievements and motivational quotes that now feel hollow. Richard gestures to a chair, coldly, without warmth. For Marcus, this was more than an interview. It was a chance to prove himself, to build a future. But for Richard, it was something else entirely. A stage where he could exercise his prejudice, his power, his belief that he alone could decide who belonged here. Marcus begins to speak, his voice steady, confident, explaining his background, his leadership and past roles, his ideas for innovation. But Richard doesn't listen. His eyes drift, his smirk grows. Every word Marcus speaks only fuels Richard's condescension. Marcus was speaking to be heard, but Richard had already closed his ears. The walls of that office seemed to close in on Marcus. Every detail of the room was designed to intimidate. The glossy mahogany desk, the towering shelves, the oversized leather chair Richard sat in like a throne. But the most suffocating thing of all was Richard's gaze. Cold,
calculating, dismissing. His fingers pressed lightly against the paper, steadying himself as if holding on to his dignity with both hands. Marcus spoke with clarity. He outlined his achievements, managing a team of 25, increasing sales by 30% in less than a year, mentoring young employees into leadership roles. He spoke not just of numbers, but of vision, of integrity, of building something greater than himself. But Richard wasn't listening. He never was. He leans back, smirking, tapping his pen on the desk with growing impatience. To Richard, Marcus's words were nothing more than noise. In his mind, the decision had already been made, not based on skill, not based on merit, but on a prejudice Richard carried like a weapon. Richard interrupts Marcus mid-sentence, his voice cutting like a blade. Without even looking at the resume, Richard leaned forward and delivered the first blow. "You don't look like a fit for this company." Marcus pauses. The weight of the words lands hard. He forces a small smile, trying to maintain composure, hoping, praying that maybe he misheard, that maybe Richard meant something else. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned back further in his chair, as if enjoying the power of rejection, and spoke again, words that carried more venom than honesty. Richard gestures at Marcus's suit, his resume, his very presence, as if it all were laughable. "You people usually don't last long here. This isn't that kind of company." The music swells dark and heavy as Marcus lowers his eyes for a moment. His jaw tightens. His silence isn't weakness. It's restraint. He swallows the insult, his dignity holding him upright, where most would crumble. In that moment, Marcus knew what was happening. This wasn't an interview. It was an execution. Richard had already decided his fate before he even stepped into the room, and now, Richard was savoring it. Richard pushes the resume aside with the back of his hand, almost tossing it away like trash. The sound echoes in the silence of the room. Marcus had worked his whole life for this. Every late night of studying, every project he led, every sacrifice he made to be here, it was all being dismissed, not because of who he was, but because of what Richard chose to see. His eyes hold back the storm, his lips pressed into a firm line. He doesn't beg, he doesn't break. He simply sits there, calm, unshaken on the surface, though his silence screams louder than words. And yet, what Richard failed to realize was that the very man he was humiliating was a man whose influence reached far beyond this office. A man whose bloodline ran directly to the top of this very company. A truth that would soon turn Richard's smug grin into desperation. Arrogance blinds, but truth always reveals.
Marcus knew the interview was over long before Richard ended it. Sometimes rejection doesn't come in words, it comes in the coldness of a stare, in the smirk of a man who believes he's above you. Richard leaned back in his chair, glanced at his watch, and dismissed Marcus with a wave of his hand, like a servant being told to leave the table. Marcus stands. He adjusts his jacket, straightens his shoulders, and takes his resume back into his hands. His movements are precise, deliberate, not rushed. Even in rejection, he carries himself with dignity. Marcus could have spoken. He could have lashed out. He could have told Richard exactly who he was and why this would be the biggest mistake of his career. But he didn't. Marcus chose silence, because sometimes silence is louder than rage. Marcus walking through the hallway of the office. Employees glance up at him, some curious, some indifferent.
The receptionist offers a half smile, unsure of what happened behind closed doors. Marcus nods politely, then pushes open the glass doors and steps out into the city streets. On the surface, it looked like defeat. A man denied an opportunity he had worked for. A man turned away because of the color of his skin. But what no one in that office knew was that Marcus's steps weren't leading him away from power. They were leading him straight toward it. He leans back in his chair, proud of himself, tapping his pen against the desk with smug satisfaction. To Richard, it was just another day, another resume tossed aside, another life dismissed without a second thought. He believed he had proven his power. He believed he had reminded Marcus of his place. But Richard's arrogance blinded him to the truth. The walls he believed protected his authority were about to close in on him. Richard chuckles to himself, shaking his head like he's already forgotten Marcus's name. Richard didn't know that the man he just humiliated was not a stranger, not a random applicant. He was family, blood, directly tied to the very man who could strip Richard of everything he held dear. But fate has a way of revealing truth at the perfect time. Marcus walking through the city, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He glances at the screen, and for the first time, he smiles faintly. Because while Richard was celebrating his cruelty, Marcus was preparing for something far greater. For Richard, this was the end of a story, but for Marcus, it was only the beginning.
Marcus left the building in silence, but his silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Because some battles aren't fought in the moment, they are fought in the shadows, in the quiet, and in the perfect timing of truth. The city skyline glows in the late afternoon sun as Marcus walks down the busy street. His phone vibrates again. He answers it, his voice calm, steady. On the other end, a voice filled with warmth greets him, his older brother, David Johnson, the CEO of the very company Marcus had just walked out of. To David, Marcus was not just a brother. He was family, his confidant, his friend. And though their worlds often kept them apart, their bond had never broken. Marcus didn't tell David everything on that call, not yet. But he didn't have to. His brother could hear the weight in his voice, the heaviness behind the words. Marcus assures him it's nothing urgent, that they'll talk later. He hangs up, slipping the phone back into his pocket, a faint knowing smile crossing his face. Marcus knew. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, and soon Richard would have to face it. Richard is still in his chair, smug and self-satisfied. He pours himself a glass of water, leans back, and flips through a new resume as if Marcus never existed. To Richard, the day is already done. Victory, so he thinks, belongs to him. But arrogance has a way of making a man blind to his surroundings, blind to consequences, blind to the storm gathering right outside his window. The office door cracks open. A junior assistant peeks inside, hesitant. Richard barely glanced up. He was too absorbed in his own pride to notice the nervousness in her eyes. The assistant mentions that the CEO will be visiting the department tomorrow morning for a surprise check-in. Richard's hand freezes on the page. He forces a smile, nods, pretending to be pleased, but behind his eyes, a flicker of unease. For men like Richard, power is everything. But power borrowed is not power owned. His authority existed only so long as the man above him allowed it, and tomorrow, that man was coming. Richard adjusts his tie in the reflection of his computer screen, muttering under his breath, rehearsing charm he doesn't believe in. He's determined to look his best for the CEO, but what Richard doesn't know is that the very man he dismissed, the
the one he tossed aside like nothing, would be walking back into this building, not as a candidate, but as blood family to the man at the very top. Marcus that evening was sitting at a quiet cafe. His phone buzzes once more, a message from his brother confirming tomorrow's visit. Marcus leans back, sipping his coffee, calm. He doesn't need to plan revenge. He doesn't need to raise his voice, because fate is already setting the stage. And so the board was set. One man smug in his false victory, another patient in his quiet dignity, and above them both, a truth waiting to be revealed. Tomorrow, Richard's laughter would turn into silence, his arrogance into fear. Because when prejudice collides with power, power always wins. When the truth enters the room, lies have nowhere to hide.
The next morning came like any other. The city stirred awake, cars rushed through crowded streets, and the glass tower gleamed under the rising sun. But inside that building, tension hung in the air. Whispers passed from desk to desk. The CEO was coming. And in offices like these, a visit from the top could make or break a man. He struts through the office, adjusting his tie, flashing a rehearsed smile at every employee. He barks orders to straighten desks, polish the floor, hide the clutter. To him, appearances were everything. Richard believed today was his chance to shine, to prove his worth to the man who held his future in his hands. But arrogance always forgets that masks crack under pressure, and Richard's mask was about to shatter. The elevator doors open. A hush falls over the room. Out steps David Johnson, the CEO, confident, composed, commanding respect with nothing more than his presence. His tailored suit is sharp, his gaze steady. Employees stand a little straighter. Richard rushes forward, extending his hand with an overeager smile. Richard had studied this moment in his mind. He had rehearsed every word, every gesture. But what he hadn't rehearsed was the sight of the man who stepped out of that elevator beside David. Beside the CEO stands Marcus, calm, dignified, silent. The very man Richard had dismissed less than 24 hours ago. The same resume he tossed aside. The same man he told would never fit this company. In that instant, the blood drained from Richard's face. His practiced smile froze, his hand hanging awkwardly in the air, because suddenly, everything he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. Marcus locks eyes with Richard. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with a calmness that burns deeper than rage. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. His presence is enough. Richard stammers, his voice cracking as he tries to mask the panic rising in his chest. To the employees watching, it was just a simple introduction. To Richard, it was the unraveling of his entire world. The man he had humiliated yesterday was standing in his office today, arm in arm with the CEO. David places a hand on Marcus's shoulder, smiling proudly as he introduces him to the staff. "This is my brother, Marcus Johnson," he announces with warmth. Gasps ripple through the room. Eyes dart from Marcus to Richard, putting the pieces together. Every whisper felt like thunder in Richard's ears. Every glance from his co-workers cut deeper than a knife. Because now, the truth had stepped into the room, and lies had nowhere to hide. Richard's hands were trembling, the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His kingdom of arrogance was crumbling brick by brick. The very man he believed was beneath him was standing at the top, looking down. And for the first time in his career, Richard was powerless.
The room was silent. Silent in a way that makes men shift in their seats. Silent in a way that exposes every weakness. All eyes fell on Richard, his false confidence drained, his smile trembling at the edges. For the first time, he was the one under scrutiny. Employees whisper behind hands, exchanging glances that Richard feels piercing his back like knives. But the only gaze that mattered was David's. The CEO's eyes were calm, unreadable, but sharp as glass. David had built his company on principles, merit, respect, fairness. He believed in recognizing talent, not tearing it down. But in his brother's silence, he read the truth. He didn't need details. He didn't need an explanation. He could see it in the way Richard avoided Marcus's eyes. He could feel it in the tension that gripped the room. David steps closer to Richard, his voice polite but edged with steel. He asks about Marcus's resume, about the interview Richard conducted just yesterday. Richard swallows hard. His rehearsed charm has vanished. His words stumble, tripping over themselves like a man trying to climb out of quicksand. For a man who prided himself on control, Richard suddenly had none. Every excuse he tried to summon sounded weaker than the last. His arrogance, once so loud, had turned into stammering desperation. David doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His authority is absolute. He reminds Richard that this company was built to break barriers, not build them. He points out the wasted opportunity, the brilliance dismissed, the talent ignored, not because of qualifications, but because of prejudice. And with every word, Richard's mask crumbled further. The room could see it. The staff could feel it. The man who once sat on a throne of arrogance now stood exposed, stripped of his power, stripped of his pride. Marcus remains silent throughout. His stillness speaks louder than anger ever could. He doesn't need revenge. He doesn't need to argue. His very presence is the answer, the undeniable proof that Richard's judgment was never truth, only bias. And in that silence, Richard's downfall was complete. Not because David shouted, not because Marcus accused, but because the truth had finally stepped into the light, and Richard had nowhere left to hide. David turns to his staff, making it clear that the company will always value merit over prejudice, integrity over arrogance. He announces that Marcus will be working directly with him on upcoming projects, cementing Marcus's place in the company, not as an outsider begging for a chance, but as a leader walking in on equal ground. The applause that followed was quiet at first, but it grew, like justice filling the room. Every clap was a nail in Richard's coffin. Every cheer was a reminder that arrogance had lost and dignity had won. Richard lowers his head, his face pale, his body slumped. The man who once believed he had the power to decide Marcus's worth now sat powerless in his own office. And the cruelest irony of all, he had dismissed the very man who could have elevated him if only he had seen beyond the color of his skin. And so the tables turned. The powerful became powerless.
The dismissed became undeniable, and Richard learned the hardest truth of all, that prejudice doesn't just wound others, it destroys the man who carries it. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in silence.
By the end of that day, the office had changed. Not in its walls, not in its furniture, but in the air itself. The arrogance that once filled the room was gone. In its place stood truth, the truth of whom Marcus was, the truth of what Richard had done, and the truth that prejudice has no place in power. The staff, faces that had once looked at Marcus with indifference, now watch him with respect. The man they had seen dismissed only a day earlier was now standing at the CEO's side, his dignity intact, his silence transformed into strength. Richard sat alone at his desk, his pride shattered. The throne he had built out of arrogance had crumbled beneath him. His whispers of judgment, his smirks of dismissal, none of it could save him now. Because the moment truth entered the room, his lies lost all their power. Marcus walks past Richard, his expression calm. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't even look down at the man who had once looked down on him. He simply walks forward, his steps firm, his path clear. Justice didn't need rage. Justice had already spoken through silence, through dignity, through revelation. And Richard finally understood. He had not just rejected an applicant, he had rejected integrity. He had rejected fairness, and in doing so, he had rejected his own future. He addresses the staff, his voice strong, his words echoing through the office. He reminded them all of a truth too often forgotten, that talent has no color, that brilliance knows no boundaries, and that dignity always outshines arrogance. The music swells, rising into something powerful, triumphant. He lost more than an opportunity that day. He lost his mask. He lost the illusion of power he had clung to. And Marcus? Marcus gained something greater than a position. He gained the respect that was always his, the recognition of his worth, the justice of truth revealed. Marcus stepped outside the building once more, but this time, the sunlight hits differently. His shoulders are lighter. His silence has spoken, and the city around him seems to hum with quiet victory. And so the story ends where it began, with a man walking into a building. But this time, he doesn't walk in seeking approval. He walks in carrying justice, and his very presence is the lesson Richard and the world needed to learn. Prejudice blinds, dignity reveals, justice restores.